For more on developments in the Islamic State story, I'm joined by Thomas Lynch. He's a foreign policy analyst, and he writes and lectures on counterterrorism in the Middle East, and it's always good to see you. Thanks again for coming in, Thomas.
Good to be here, Mike.
Lots of criticism on the U.S. president's strategy this week on both sides of the aisle. Senator Rand Paul the other day saying the Obama administration doesn't even know who these moderate rebels are. And then you have a liberal like Loretta Sanchez from California today saying to Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel that she knows who the commander-in-chief is here, but do they even have any idea who the commander-in-chief is of these moderate rebels? Is that a fair criticism?
Yeah, Mike, good to be here again, and thanks for having me to talk about my research and not representing my university, the U.S. government, or the Department of Defense, who you heard from officially today on Capitol Hill with the Secretary testifying. No, I think you're highlighting the fact this is a very complex and fluid environment, and as we've discussed in previous times, there are a lot of shifting forces and factions in that part of the world. Now, IS or ISIL has benefited from those shifting factions over the last 18 months. 18 months ago, you can't find a reference to ISIL. Right. It was part of the amorphous constellation of Salafi jihadist fighters fighting the Assad regime. I think what's happening now is we're trying to create a similar type of fair winds to coalesce some very murky and dispersed forces within that region, recognizing that we don't want to put American soldiers on the ground having to go into close combat. So I think it's recognizable that Congress would have some concerns right now, but you're not going to get anything much more clear, I would argue, for quite a while to come in that part of the world.
The coalition, we're hearing from France, they've agreed to participate, Australia, a number of other countries stepping up saying they'll do this or that. But this criticism that Sean alluded to in his piece, that there are concerns up on Capitol Hill that perhaps not enough Arab nations carrying water on this, that the United States and the West are going to be the ones having to do much of the work here, the grunt work, so to speak. Do you think there's much of an argument there?
I think there is from a second dimension. That is the dimension that people can see. I study and look at what's going on behind the scenes, and there's an awful lot going on behind the scenes from Saudi Arabia, from Qatar, from Kuwait, and even in Jordan, where we may not like the way in which they're reacting, and they're not advertising a lot of the way they're reacting, but there are things coming out of state-sponsored religious mosques in Saudi Arabia that I'm tracking that are really hammering IS and are really trying to take the wind out of the sails of any financing or any long-term future. The King of Jordan and his people have gone pretty soft on some pretty shady characters who have assisted radical groups in the past, basically either allowing them out of jails or allowing them to leave so long as they issue fatwas against IS, and so long as they are last seen going across the border into Syria to organize and marshal forces. Now, this gives us concerns in the West because we don't know, who's worse than whom, but that's that part of the world. And indeed, right now, IS is everybody's favorite target, to include other Islamists. And here, a lot of the governments in the Gulf region, although they're trying to play to the moderate factions as well, because they don't want blowback in their capitals, they are willing to let these groups run for a little bit now to kind of take the legs out from underneath IS in Syria. Here, the U.S. is finally now getting on board with some serious money and attention to doing that, and I think that's what you saw on Capitol Hill today.
Moderate Syrian rebels, one would think that their big beef is with the Assad forces, not necessarily ISIS, and that was one of the other concerns that was raised on Capitol Hill. Are they really going to go after these guys when their real aim is to go after the government itself? Is that a concern?
Well, it is, but let's talk about things in terms of sequencing. Many of these groups have been disadvantaged by IS or ISIL. What you see running around in these videos of IS and ISIL, a lot of these are pieces of equipment captured not from Iraqi forces, but from groups inside Syria that were getting funded, armed, and trained. And these guys, like the big bully on the block, came in, seized them, and took them for their own purposes. So I think you've got at least a reasonable expectation that in the short term, there's some vengeance and retribution here between the different Sunni groups that feel ISIL has taken advantage of them. In the mid to longer term, though, yeah, the Assad regime is still on the menu, and it's just going to come a little later.
We all remember September 11th here in Washington, D.C., and the President of the United States at the time, President Bush, saying that he was going to go after al-Qaeda. It seems as though al-Qaeda is kind of the back page, and ISIS, to many, seems even worse than al-Qaeda. Is there a concern that once you knock them down, the next thing that emerges is even worse? Yeah,
well, Mike, you and I have had this conversation before, and I think it's part of the difficulty in understanding kind of the frame of reference in that part of the world where I've spent a lot of time over the last decade. Yes, there are very radical strains that exist. Yes, periodically some of these coalesce and get greater traction in one country or another. In the early 90s, it was Algeria. For a while, it was Somalia. We've seen it in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and yes, it could materialize there if we're not cautious. We've seen it in Yemen. Now we're seeing it as a result of the spillover of the Syrian civil war, and in Iraq that's had some real political problems since the U.S.'s departure in 2010. So yes, it's a legitimate fear that something else could pop up. But as an old adage says in the farm world, you know, you deal with the horse closest to the wagon, right? You manage that one first. And here IS, although I would argue to you it's nowhere near as dangerous as bin Laden's al-Qaeda to the West and to West's interests, IS is kind of an indiscriminate, very noisy, a very aspirational group that in reality doesn't have a lot of support outside of some of the Sunni sheiks in Western Iraq. So if that support can be cut away, if they can be taken off their game, so to speak, delayed, disrupted, and not allowed to get a physical state from which to start planning and plotting against other targets in the region or the West, I think they are a group that can be managed away. They don't have a safe haven, and they don't have many friends in the world. This is different than Omar's Taliban. This is different than bin Laden's al-Qaeda. So I think they are manageable, but the point is right. There are still other groups out there that aren't going to go away in the interim, so I think we just need to steel ourselves with a resolve that we deal with the big problem right now, and we don't think it's going to solve all these problems immediately.
All right, Thomas Lynch, thank you so much for coming in. Certainly appreciate it.
Great, Mike. Thank you.